Additional U.S. forces are being deployed to the Middle East as the war with Iran continues to expand. Now, this comes as only 38% of Americans support the war, a shockingly low number at the start of a conflict. I mean, by comparison, 90% supported our going into Afghanistan and 76% were on board with the invasion of Iraq. And by all accounts right now, this war is continuing to expand. We've seen horizontal escalation in recent days, pulling in other countries in the Middle East, and the target set just changed overnight with the United States and Israel appearing to be going after oil refineries inside of Iran. On top of that, the U.S. troop buildup continues, and this is in line with what Secretary Hegseth and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Kane, have both said in recent days, that we are adding more forces every single day to the Middle East. Overnight, Fox News said that the 3rd Carrier Strike Group is set to deploy. They said the USS George H.W. Bush Carrier Strike Group completed its pre-deployment training on Thursday and is expected to deploy soon, likely to the Eastern Mediterranean. They note that it joins the USS Gerald R. Ford as well as the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Groups. It's possible the Bush is replacing the Ford that is now overextended on their deployment. Haven't heard whether that is the case or if there's going to be a significant period of overlap or if we are just going to have 3 carrier strike groups in the Mediterranean or in the Middle East indefinitely until this war is wrapped up. But that brings to something worth addressing that I feel like isn't getting enough attention, which is assessing U.S. and Israeli progress so far in this war. And the Washington Institute put together, I think, a great article on this earlier today, Michael Singh specifically, that we're going to run through and highlight some of these things worth looking at. He says, while the United States and Israel are winning based on measures like the degradation of Iran's naval force and missiles, a broader victory will require securing domestic support and avoiding the maximalism that has hindered past American military efforts. So when looking at the domestic support, this is one we're just starting to get poll numbers on, and it's going to require a significant change to get Americans on board with the war after the hostilities have begun. I feel like that's challenging. I don't know that we have a lot of examples where that's actually worked out. This is coming from a Substack titled Strength in Numbers. I'll have this linked in the description below, where they say, according to a simple average of new high-quality surveys, 38% of Americans approve and 49% disapprove of U.S. military action in Iran. When ignoring don't know respondents, 56% disapprove. They say the big takeaway from these numbers is that the new war in Iran is very unpopular. Not merely negative numbers, so what unpopular, but worst ever support for war when it started unpopular. They say 38% is lower than the support for the war in Iraq in 2014. I feel like most people didn't know the war in Iraq was still going on in 2014, but at this point, they're saying more Americans supported troops on the ground in Iraq at that point than support operations in Iran today, 1 week in to Operation Epic Fury. They say no president in modern polling history has ever launched a major military operation with the public already against him. After the September 11th attacks, a November poll found 90% of Americans approved of military action in Afghanistan, with just 5% opposed. The Gulf War in 1991 hit 79 to 80% approval. Gallup measured 76 support for the invasion of Iraq in 2003, adding that Pew had it at 71%. They said even more recent operations still drew majority backing. Trump's own Syria strikes in April 2017 polled at 50% approve, 41% disapprove, and Obama's Libya intervention in 2011 came in at 47 approve to 37% disapprove. This is an uphill battle. There's no two ways about it. The fighting has now begun. U.S. casualties have already occurred. We're getting more news each day of the damage to U.S. bases across the region. And of course, we're seeing a shift in strategy right now, and more on this in a second, where Iran is just trying to survive, and that's going to be inflicting economic pain on the United States. So the Trump administration right now has to increase support for the war at the same time that we are likely to be feeling the impacts of that war day to day. I mean, gas prices is just a great example here, right? Now, continuing on with the Washington Institute, they say it's unclear how either the United States or Israel measures progress towards these objectives or how to independently measure that progress at this stage. And what we've seen so far from U.S. Central Command and from the IDF is kind of measuring the number of strikes. So CENTCOM put out their assessment just yesterday, saying they've hit over 3,000 targets and they've damaged or destroyed 43 Iranian warships. The IDF put one out just earlier today saying they've hit 750 targets, 300 missile launchers dismantled and 40 senior Iranian officials eliminated. Now, look, the reduction in missile launches that we were hearing quoted from Admiral Cooper and the commander of U.S. Central Command and General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that is significant, but it's not the full story because that tells us kind of a reduction in their capabilities for their missiles. The big problem here is the effect that those strikes are having. So, like, we don't want anything to blow up a oil refinery or a U.S. base or a ship trying to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. If it happens with a drone, it's still bad. So while we are seeing a reduction in missile launchers, that shows that the strikes against the mobile launchers and missile locations have been effective. We have to get to the point where Iran is not able to impact or affect anything with those launches across the region. They say, according to the U.S. Defense Department, numerous Islamic Republic of Iran Navy ships have been eliminated, but this leaves out the IRGC's fleet of fast boats, autonomous naval systems, and midget submarines. U.S. officials have also asserted that Iran's missile threat is declining, but they have not clarified how many missiles or what types Iran still possesses. Iran's ability to continue firing missiles and drones is concerning and may be a function of the U.S. decision not to employ ground forces, which is likely rooted more in politics than strategy. So again, yes, we want to see those launch numbers reduced. And the fact that the missile launches are down significantly, we're talking, we might be at single digits today for the first time since the war began. It's fallen off a cliff in terms of Iranian missile launches. But still today, we saw boats in the Gulf hit. We saw civilian infrastructure hit. We saw U.S. bases targeted. So the numbers might be down. The effects of those strikes are still having, for the most part, the same impact throughout the war. They say while the United States and Israel have reportedly conducted further strikes on Iranian nuclear sites, such as those at Natanz, certain tasks such as removing the enriched uranium or verifying other sites do not pose a proliferation risk, cannot be done through strikes alone. Likewise, while degrading the IRGC can undermine Iran's ability to support its proxies, countering other key elements of that support, such as financing, calls for the use of different tools. And we've talked about this right when the war was getting ready to begin, was of all of the different things being laid out that could be possible objectives for the United States, only some of them have any likelihood of being accomplished with air power and standoff munitions alone. The destruction of the Navy is one, although the Washington Institute just talked there about how the Navy is more than just their large surface boats, which we can, and for the most part now, have destroyed. We can destroy all of the missile launchers, but again, the big component there is can they sling a drone every so often? The Houthis, a few months ago, great example. We hammered them. It was not a close fight, not at all. Stopping the shipping through the Red Sea required just one drone attack every couple days, and they didn't even have to hit the ship. That's the issue that we're dealing with right now in the Strait of Hormuz, the tool, really, that Iran has pulled out. Now, in terms of additional tools being utilized here, the possibility of troops on the ground is being mentioned more and more recently. This is something that when the war kicked off, it was, we're not considering that, it's not in the cards, all the way, and it's shifted in recent days to, we're not going to tell you what might be on the table, we're not going to remove any options, all the way to some reports yesterday saying that President Trump is considering it and is actually in favor of boots on the ground for accomplishing some of these objectives. The closest we have at this point in any indications that there are deployments of ground forces, be it Army or Marines, headed in that direction was just yesterday, where U.S. officials told ABC News that the Army has canceled a major training exercise involving elements of the 82nd Airborne Division from Fort Bragg. This was their JRTC rotation, from what I understand, which this is significant. Right? There's a lot of planning, a lot of resources, a lot of money goes into this, years of planning to get this. These JRTC rotations are like years out, right? It's a big deal. I don't know what it looked like in 2001, 2003, those windows at the start of Afghanistan and Iraq, but for the bulk of the global war on terror, we were not pulling units out of JRTC rotations because those are necessary to get them up to speed before deployment. So notable here, take it with a grain of salt, it's still pretty early. Also being pulled from a training exercise is a far cry from jumping over Tehran and securing airfields in the middle of Iran. Either way, 82nd Airborne, of course, getting some attention here because that is our rapid response force. They are able to deploy anywhere in the world pretty quickly. So seeing them, kind of put on standby, for lack of better terms, definitely raised some alarms. Now, one thing to keep in mind when we're looking at this assessment of the war in Iran is we are effectively fighting two different wars. We are not measuring the same things. And we might not even be measuring the same things as Israel at this point. When you think of historic conflicts, you're measuring casualties or maybe territory gained. Even in Russia and Ukraine, we can look at that to a degree of who's advancing and who is not advancing. We have very different objectives here, all right? So it makes it very difficult to look at the scoreboard and say definitively that one side is ahead or not. As an example here, the U.S. objectives as laid out by the White House recently is the destruction of the Iranian regime's missiles, the annihilation of their navy, ensuring their proxies can no longer destabilize the world, and ensuring Iran can never obtain a nuclear weapon. All right? That's the U.S. objectives. The Iranian objectives are to get the United States and Israel to stop and survive. They're very different. All right, so this is why we're seeing different tactics utilized. Yes, the United States would be closer to accomplishing all of those if we are able to destroy their missiles, their navy, their proxy networks, all of that. But technically, we're fighting two different wars at this point. So the scoreboard doesn't always line up. The Washington Institute says, quote, the conundrum that U.S. officials face is while the United States and Israel are clearly winning the war in military terms, if they stopped fighting today, they would be judged to have lost. If commercial shipping does not quickly resume, or if Iran retains the ability to menace the Middle East with missiles and drones, or to resume its progress towards a nuclear weapon, then the war will have achieved little at great cost. They say while no amount of military force can permanently deny Iran these capabilities, the minimal condition for victory must be eliminating Iran's ability to pose a serious conventional or nuclear threat to the United States, Israel, or the broader region. And to this end, again, we're talking about fighting two different wars. Two different objectives, two different means to get to those objectives. We saw just a few hours ago that the United States and Israel appear to be targeting oil refineries in Tehran, so going after more economic targets, supporting the regime. I wouldn't say we've moved on entirely from military targets. There's likely still a bunch to be hit, especially in central and western Iran. But some pretty crazy footage coming out of at least 3 oil facilities being hit in Iran in the last 12 hours. And we did get notification from both U.S. and Iranian officials just today that both of them are getting ready to move on to new targets. So Iran has already seen some effects of shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. Gas prices are going way up. I think it was today, Kuwait said they're shutting off one of their refineries for a period of time. And if the U.S. starts going after Iranian refineries, we have to expect that Iran might try to double down and go after refineries in other states across the Middle East. Now, this might be one of the reasons, starting to feel a bit of pressure here. Again, it's not military pressure, it's economic pressure and diplomatic pressure as the strait gets shut off. President Trump seemingly earlier today, not seemingly, he said Iran surrendered to the Middle East, but then called on their surrender and said strikes will continue until they surrender. Quote, Iran, which is being beat to hell, has apologized and surrendered to its Middle East neighbors and promised that it will not shoot at them anymore. Iran is no longer the bully of the Middle East. They are instead the loser of the Middle East and will be for many decades until they surrender or more likely completely collapse. Today, Iran will be hit very hard. So a little confusing there. I don't think it's crazy that Trump is starting to look for some off-ramps. Again, it's not the military losses. We are very clearly achieving military objectives. We are winning that. But this other side of the conflict that Iran is choosing to fight is already starting to have an impact back home. And I wonder if President Trump is trying to find a bit of an off-ramp there. This whole Iran surrendered thing, I think it was mostly just a misunderstanding. It seems like their president put out a statement saying that yesterday they decided that their neighboring countries will no longer be subject to our attacks and missile strikes, except in cases when attacks on Iran occur from the territories of these states. That's kind of like what it's already been to a degree. A lot of these countries, before the war began, did not authorize U.S. flyovers or the use of U.S. bases in their countries to attack Iran. That didn't matter. Iran attacked them anyways. They even came out a few hours later to clarify these statements, saying, we will only attack any countries that allow U.S. forces to base out of. But during that time period, we saw additional Iranian strikes on civilian infrastructure in a number of countries. So I would not put much stock in the idea that Iran at this point has surrendered in any way, shape, or form. The Washington Institute says some will insist that the war is a failure unless regime change is achieved, arguing that leaving the regime in place will enable the persistence of Iran's threats to U.S. national security in some form. However, the belief that victory in war requires the achievement of maximalist aims has led to costly multi-decade conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the Trump administration should not repeat this error in Iran. That was a very interesting line because yesterday, President Trump said, quote, "There will be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender. And after that, the selection of a great and acceptable leader." So it seems like kind of pedal to the metal. Also, regime change clearly in the cards for the United States here. One thing I think we have to keep in mind is it is entirely possible right now that as we start to feel the direct impacts of this war here in the United States, that President Trump declares victory and people just pile on and say, yeah, clearly it's victory because A, B, C, and D. In fact, this has already kind of started to circulate on Fox News. Here's a clip of some of their commentators just kind of listing all the reasons that the United States has already won this war.
So let's think about what has happened. Let's list it out. So we took out the Iranian regime leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, and then 40 of the top leaders. We degraded their military. You can see we've been laying that out all day, all morning. We've because they've decided to attack their neighbors, and we've kind of unified them behind us. So that's kind of worked in our favor to some degree. We've outed fake allies, Spain, England, right? Why should we ever help them again? This is a way to reveal that. We talked a little bit about the insurance situation for ships coming across the Straits of Hormuz. So there's that angle as well, which is very interesting. So to me, this already looks like victory. And so I say, let's declare victory very quickly.
I mean, this is a bit of a wild card, right? I don't know what percentage I would put on this, but I think more than any other president, in my lifetime at least, there is the very real possibility that President Trump declares victory and we're moving on. We have a parade and move on to the next thing. I don't think that would be good. I think that would put Iran as a wounded country in a position more likely to pursue a nuclear weapon, more likely to want to rebuild their missile infrastructure, more likely to double down on their proxies, and more likely to use the Strait of Hormuz as a negotiating tool, a terror tool next time around because they saw the impact. So I think stopping right now would be a real problem. My issue overall here is I don't know that we went into this ready to really see it through to the end. Again, some of these objectives that the Trump administration is seemingly pursuing requires some degree of forces on the ground, whether that's U.S. forces, partner forces, or sources and forces inside of Iran. Somebody has to do that. And it's not clear to me at all who that's going to be at this point. Makes me a little bit nervous that the planning may not have been there after day 1, 2, or 3 of the military strikes. But either way, that's about where things sit right now. That's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.